Thanks, Tim, and good morning. I'm going to reflect a little bit. When Ken Lay was talking this morning about 38 years in the same organisation, I nearly put my hand up. I've got 40 years in February, but I won't make it. I'm going to retire in December, so not that I'm counting, but I've got 10 weeks to go. So I thought I might reflect a little bit on the last 5 years as Head of Profession of the Professional Standards Command of the New South Wales Police Force, which is a place 40 years ago I never thought I'd end up, but I have. I thought I would be an operational commander, which has been my career for a long, long time. But the Commissioner had a different idea, and as it turns out, many of my peers these days, Emmett Dunn, Paul Doyle, Ray Johnson and some others who have ended up as heads of profession, haven't had their career in that stream of internal affairs, but they come from other places. And I'm not sure if that was a plan by the Commissioners, but we've worked very well as a group, and I think there's been significant change in how ethical and professional standards commands have worked in the last 5 years, simply because the commanders have come in with new ideas. The environment in New South Wales Police is there's 16,000 sworn officers covered by the Police Act and 3,500 unsworn officers covered by the Public Sector Management Act. The last major independent review in terms of integrity or corruption issues was James Wood's Royal Commission in 1996. And Mr Woods is still around, and I had the pleasure of working with him on the Sentencing Council for a few years, and he's as sharp as ever. The things that we did quite visibly from that Royal Commission were structural change, a major structural change. We've got to look different and operate differently. Buried in amongst some of his quite futuristic recommendations were changes to complaint handling and the discipline process that we had. And we are one of the only agencies in New South Wales that has its statement of values enshrined in the legislation. It sits in the regulations there. But James Wood, and I often quote this, spoke about a number of things. And we didn't do it probably until about 2009 or 10. And he spoke about that in terms of the performance or behaviour of conduct police officers, the first recourse should be to remedial, not punitive. However, those who grossly offend against proper standards should expect nothing less than an early exit from the organisation. So he picked up on the last bit and kept trying to sack people, but we never ever picked up on the first bit about how you work with people. And simply these days, one of our processes could be defined as, do we sack people or do we save them? You know, we need to get people thinking like that. The process in terms of complaint management and handling is a locally based one, and that again comes out of some of Wood's recommendations, where local commands look after the investigation and management of complaints against police officers, although they are centrally quality controlled, if you like, through my command and recorded on a central database. In 2008, when I went to the command, I had some 300 staff. I've now got 240 staff, and that is simply about efficiencies. The other thing that has changed quite significantly is probably in the early 2000s, there were about 6,500 complaints a year for 14,000 officers. At the moment, we have about 5,000, 5,100 complaints a year for over 16,000 officers. The reverse triangle, if you like, so, and we've also changed the processes. We've moved to a model of streamlining processes and engaging in triaging and resolving complaints with complainants rather than conducting a formal investigation for every single complaint. So about 80% of complaints are now resolved at a local level with the complainant. They still appear on the system, and a matter may be sustained against an officer. That's been a wonderful process, I think, particularly in relation to complainants, because an old assistant ombudsman said to me one day, he said, Paul, you know, you've got to listen to what people are writing, because it's not necessarily what they're trying to say to you. So you have to go and actually engage with them about what their complaint is. It's not just what's written in their complaint, which is what we used to do. We'd assess the complaint, we'd kick off a formal investigation, we'd take statements and we'd have an outcome. We engage much more with complainants these days. But however, there are still about 800 more serious complaints investigated formally across the year. We do many of those, but although some commands still do those themselves. Out of that, there's probably about 100 police officers a year charged with criminal offences. and I'm the senior officer who authorises those matters. I also suspend all those police officers in terms of a risk management strategy. I also recommend the sanctions against officers in terms of a sustained finding against them. And I also recommend all of those officers who need to be dismissed to the Commissioner, and I take those papers to him. So I suspect there won't be many people at my send-off, but that's the way it goes. No, there will be. No, that's all right. That's just good open work, and that's what we do. I mean, that's the reality, and that's the way it is. There are probably about 20 to 25 officers that the Commissioner considers dismissing a year, and the old piece of legislation which was put into place post the Royal Commission for Peter Ryan was loses Commissioner's confidence, which sounds wonderful. We're trying to get that changed. Sounds wonderful, but doesn't stand up in the Industrial Relations Commission. If you dismiss someone, you go to the Industrial Relations Commission, which in New South Wales where you can go. The test in the Industrial Relations Commission is, was this harsh, unreasonable or unjust? Not that you lost confidence of the Commissioner, so there's a conflict with the legislation, but we've only lost 2 matters in the last 2 years in terms of dismissals that we've had returned. I think that Woods had a good understanding of what the community wanted. I also think he had a good understanding of the responsibility of the New South Wales Police Force as an employer. What I found when I went to my command in 2008 is it was a command set up basically from a number of units post-Royal Commission, and they focused on corrupt cops in the late 90s and 2000s. But it had become separated from the organisation. It had become secret, and people had stayed there for a long, long time. And I took one operational police officer with me, and what we found is quite frankly, people had been there too long, and that was unhealthy for them, and it was unhealthy for the organisation. So you don't see good stuff in professional standards. We needed to change the culture of that part of the organisation as well. And we did. And in fact, in the last 3 years, of the 240 staff, I've turned over 100 staff. We promote people into professional standards. They do 2 or 3 years, and they go back to field or specialist commands. Now that's very healthy, including my senior officers, so superintendents and chief superintendents, for 2 reasons. One is it encourages good operational police to come in and do the hard work, and they do it. And then they go back out having learned about the things that need to be done to prevent that behavioural conduct from happening. The other thing that we've done is opened up the command to the rest of the organisation. The rest of the organisation can basically see what we are doing in terms of complaints, managing individuals. We have commanders and portfolio holders come through the command on a regular basis, and we speak regularly to command meetings. And we take on a lot more jobs than we used to in the old days. We used to only take on the more serious matters. But some places need a hand in dealing with complaints against police officers. For example, in the far western part of the state, there may be a complaint from members of the Aboriginal community about police officers. It's good for someone independent and objective to come in and resolve that matter rather than the local command doing it, if you like, and then not sustaining something against the police officer. So from time to time, we need to wear the black hat, ride into town and go, the cops were wrong, and then go back out. Now that allows the community and the police to resolve some issues, but there's quite a positive reaction to the complaint, and we do that from time to time. Every complaint we have is oversighted by the Ombudsman, and the Police Integrity Commission have access to all our complaints. Although they're not involved in the administration and management of our complaints, they take the more serious investigations that they want to look at. And I guess there's been a change in the type of complaints that have been around for some time. The positive stuff done in the last few years includes establishing a research group. When I got there was no research. PIC was doing all the research, so I've established a group under an inspector who is currently doing a PhD through Charles Sturt, so we now do research in relation to much the same sort of stuff as you're doing. We implemented an ethical health strategy to consider what the health of the organisation was ethically, and it's something that the rest of the country is looking at as well. We're looking at a range of corruption resistance strategies. And I guess, and I'll talk about this in a little bit in a moment, we really are heavily involved in drug and alcohol testing now. And we're also looking at what we do in relation to sanctions against police officers, how we actually, work with police officers who have sustained complaint findings against them, and how we actually work through that. One of the things that I found, and I hadn't realised, even though I'd done a lot of complaints with my police officers as a commander, and I was a commander of the Sydney CBD for a long time, was we were actually being unfair to our police officers. We weren't being procedurally fair in relation to the way we managed the investigation with them. If we're doing that with normal criminal investigations, we'd be smashed all over the place. We weren't telling the officers what were going on. We weren't providing them with a copy of the brief at the end. We weren't allowing them to consider our conclusions based on the inculpatory and exculpatory evidence. And we've changed all of that. We've given them actually an opportunity to respond to what we're doing. And a key component with that is when police are interviewed or they give a statement, they just give you the bare facts. They don't tell you a lot of other stuff. When you hand the brief back and say, this is what we found and this is what we may do with you, they then actually give up a lot of other stuff, which helps you manage them. And that's good. It's good for the brief, but it's also good to work with. So that's been a major breakthrough. And what we found was the Public Sector Management Act, in terms of handling complaints, is much fairer than the Police Act, so we changed that. In terms of integrity, the drug and alcohol issues is the one that I've put the executive on notice about. A couple of years ago, we started to notice more and more drug briefs coming through. And the history of alcohol testing was post-Royal Commission. We introduced drug and alcohol testing in the early 2000s, and we probably do about 15,000 tests a year with about a dozen positive hits. But we didn't do a lot of drug tests. In fact, in 2009, I think we only did 2,000 drug tests. They were expensive. And we did drug testing out of human resources as a safety and a health issue. But I argued with the executive it's a conduct issue. They're breaking the law, they're buying drugs. Yeah, there may be a health issue. So the drug and alcohol testing came to my command. Drug and alcohol testing unit came to my command. And what we did was we found a cheaper test, a cheaper drug urine test. We also evoked a piece of the legislation which is about hair sampling, and we now do that. And as a consequence, last financial year we did 5,000 tests, as I suspected, with a lot more positive hits. But that's what it's about. You've got to go out and find that stuff. We do particularly drug testing in three ways. We do random testing. We go out and do random testing police station without announcing that we're going to be there. We do targeted tests based on information or intelligence about that someone may be using drugs, illicit drugs. We do mandatory testing after something like a critical incident where a person's been seriously injured or killed as a result of a police operation. And we supplement the targeted and mandatory tests with hair sampling. So our testers are trained to take a hair sample, and the hair tells a long story about drug use. And the urine test often, because of the Australian standards, may come up negative, but the hair will come up positive if they're a long-term drug user. And we really do need to focus on that, on the drug testing issue. One of the things that working with the oversight agencies, particularly the Ombudsman and PIC and the Coroner, is despite, I suppose, being heavily involved in writing some of these things, is we're still writing cop speak. We still write in a language that we understand, and we arrive at conclusions that perhaps we can understand. But more and more, through the Ombudsman's Office, the PIC and the Coroner, I'm coming to the realisation that we don't actually write for a wider audience in relation to what we do, why we did it, and how we came to the conclusions that we did. So, for example, in a homicide investigation, whether it's the homicide of a police officer or the homicide of somebody else, there might be 1,000 things you can do in terms of resolving that matter. Along the way, the investigators will choose to do 500, and that's very visible. What we don't do is explain why we didn't do the other 500 things, why we didn't interview another 20 witnesses. We don't explain that very well, and that's where the questions come from. We can see what you did, but why didn't you do these other things? So we're actually rethinking that, and for a critical incident, for example, current report might be 50 pages long. In the future, it might be 200 pages, but that'll be okay because people can read what we've done, and I think that's important. I've got a tapping on the glass. I'm happy to take questions about anything in the last 40 years. Thank you.